What would you sacrifice for loyalty? Your home, your livelihood, even your life. In the chaos of the American Revolution, thousands of men and women were forced to answer this very question. For some, loyalty meant standing with their neighbors and fighting for independence. For others, it meant holding fast to the British crown, even as it risked everything they held dear. The America of the 1770s wasn't simply a battleground between colonies and an empire. It was a nation divided, a civil war at its core. Communities fractured, friendships dissolved, and families were torn apart. Fathers turned against sons, and lifelong neighbours became sworn enemies. Among this chaos, nearly 1/5 of the population chose to side with the British. These loyalists weren't just the wealthy elite or high-ranking officials. They were farmers, merchants, enslaved people, and Native Americans. For some, loyalty was rooted in principle. For others, it was a matter of pragmatism, choosing the known stability of British rule over the uncertainty of rebellion. But loyalty came at a high price. Businesses were destroyed, homes were confiscated, and loyalists became targets of mob violence and public humiliation. By the end of the war, as many as 70,000 loyalists fled their homes, becoming refugees in Canada, the Caribbean, or even Britain itself. Despite their sacrifices, their stories often go untold, overshadowed by the tales of the patriots who shaped America's fight for independence. Today, we're diving into the lives of 7 famous loyalists who dared to stand against the revolutionary tide. Their stories are a window into the human cost of war, the complexity of loyalty, and the sacrifices that shaped the course of history. From Benjamin Franklin's estranged son to a Mohawk warrior and an enslaved man's fight for freedom. These are the untold stories of the American Revolution. Let's begin. Imagine being the son of one of America's most revered patriots, Benjamin Franklin. The elder Franklin, a symbol of revolution and independence, was a driving force behind the colony's fight against British rule. Now picture standing on the opposite side of that fight, choosing loyalty to the British crown over allegiance to your father. This was the reality of William Franklin, Benjamin's illegitimate son, whose story is one of heartbreaking division and unwavering conviction. William Franklin wasn't a typical loyalist. Raised under the guidance of his famous father, he inherited Benjamin's wit, intelligence, and ambition. The two shared a close bond, collaborating on projects like Poor Richard's Almanac. Benjamin even used his influence to secure William's appointment as the governor of the colonial province of New Jersey. By all accounts, the father and son were a formidable team. But as tensions escalated between the colonies and Britain, their ideological differences began to surface. Benjamin, ever the revolutionary, urged his son to side with the Patriots. William, however, saw the growing rebellion as dangerous and unnecessary. As governor, he believed the colonies could resolve their grievances through diplomacy rather than war. "You have now pointed out to you, gentlemen, 2 roads," he implored the New Jersey legislature in 1775, one evidently leading to peace, happiness, and a restoration of the public tranquility, the other inevitably conducting you to anarchy, misery, and all the horrors of a civil war. William's plea fell on deaf ears. When New Jersey chose revolution, his loyalty to the crown made him a target. Placed under house arrest for his political stance, he was eventually imprisoned in Connecticut. His captors accused him of secretly communicating with other loyalists, plotting to undermine the Patriot cause. For this, he was thrown into solitary confinement, a punishment so severe that he wrote to Connecticut's governor, pleading for death over his conditions. "I suffer so much in being thus buried alive, having no one to speak to day or night, and for the want of air and exercise, that I should deem it a favour to be immediately taken out and shot." William's imprisonment came with additional heartbreak. Denied the chance to see his dying wife, he endured profound isolation. Released as part of a prisoner exchange in 1778, he made his way to British-controlled New York, where he became a prominent Loyalist leader. Despite the adversity, he remained resolute in his beliefs, organizing guerrilla attacks against Patriot forces and steadfastly defending the crown. At the war's end, William Franklin fled. As we move from William Franklin's personal heartbreak to another Loyalist story, we shift to Boston, a city at the heart of the revolutionary fervor. Here we meet Thomas Hutchinson, a man who didn't just witness history, he stood at the crossroads of it. His loyalty to Britain wasn't driven by blind allegiance, but by a strategic attempt to navigate a storm he couldn't control. Born into one of Massachusetts' most prominent families, Hutchinson seemed destined for success. A skilled merchant, respected judge, and eventually the governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, he was a man of intellect and pragmatism. Yet, his remarkable career unfolded during some of Boston's most turbulent years. Hutchinson's troubles began with the Stamp Act of 1765, a controversial British tax that inflamed colonial resentment. As lieutenant governor, Hutchinson privately opposed the Stamp Act, recognizing its potential to incite unrest. But his position of authority made him a lightning rod for anger. An enraged mob stormed his mansion, looting and nearly destroying it, leaving Hutchinson and his family shaken but resolute. Despite his personal losses, Hutchinson stayed loyal to Britain, believing that rebellion would only lead to chaos. His pragmatism guided his decisions as acting governor during the Boston Massacre in 1770. Hutchinson ensured that the British soldiers involved were put on trial, a move that temporarily cooled tensions. But his careful diplomacy couldn't satisfy the growing revolutionary fervor. To many Bostonians, Hutchinson was not a mediator, but a symbol of oppressive British authority. The tipping point came in 1773 with the Tea Act. While other colonial leaders refused to accept British tea shipments, Hutchinson insisted the duties be paid. His decision enraged the Sons of Liberty, who retaliated with the infamous Boston Tea Party. As crates of tea spilled into the harbour, so did any hopes Hutchinson had of restoring order. By 1774, the political landscape had shifted irreversibly, and Hutchinson sailed to England, seeking to broker peace between the colonies and the crown. He never returned. Exiled from his homeland, Hutchinson became a tragic figure, caught between two worlds and abandoned by both. Historians often view Hutchinson with sympathy, recognizing the impossible position he faced. With the exception of a handful of nasty people, much of the rest of the Loyalists are quite tragic stories, says historian Ben Marsh. Hutchinson's loyalty wasn't to oppression, but to stability. Yet his efforts to maintain peace only deepened his alienation. Thomas Hutchinson's story reminds us of the human cost of loyalty during the American Revolution. For him, choosing the crown meant losing not just his career, but his home, his community, and ultimately, his legacy. As we leave behind Thomas Hutchinson's calculated pragmatism, we turn to a different kind of loyalist, one whose story is far less sympathetic and much more infamous. Not every loyalist of the Revolution was a tragic figure caught in impossible circumstances. Meet John Malcolm, a British customs officer whose zealous loyalty to the crown and his own arrogance made him a prime target for patriot mobs. Malcolm's tale is one of humiliation, defiance, and ultimately a chilling reminder of how loyalty could lead to infamy. John Malcolm's name became synonymous with overreach and cruelty. A staunch defender of British authority, Malcolm carried out his duties as a customs officer with an iron fist, seizing goods, enforcing trade laws, and reveling in the power his position afforded him. To the Patriots, he was a living embodiment of British oppression, a man who seemed to delight in antagonizing those who resisted the crown. Malcolm's first major clash with the Patriots occurred in 1773, when he boarded a ship in Maine and threatened its crew with a sword for failing to comply with British regulations. News of his overreach spread quickly, and an enraged crowd responded by stripping him of his sword, cane, hat, and wig. But they didn't stop there. In an act of public humiliation, the mob tarred and feathered him, a brutal punishment meant to shame and deter. For most, such an ordeal might have served as a sobering lesson. But not John Malcolm. Defiant as ever, he soon found himself in trouble again. In 1774, back in Boston, Malcolm got into an argument with a local shoemaker, a Patriot sympathizer, and struck the man on the head with his cane. This act of violence quickly escalated into chaos as a mob gathered outside Malcolm's home. Rather than fleeing or apologizing, Malcolm taunted the crowd from an upstairs window, shouting, "You say I was tarred and feathered, and that it was not done in a proper manner. Damn you, let me see the man that dare do it better." The Patriots were more than happy to oblige. They dragged Malcolm from his house, stripped him naked in the freezing January air, and applied hot tar directly to his skin, followed by feathers. The mob paraded him through the streets on a sled, forcing him to beg for forgiveness at various points along the way. The ordeal left Malcolm permanently scarred, both physically and emotionally. He eventually fled to England, carrying with him strips of flesh that had peeled off when the tar was removed. In London, he petitioned the king, decrying the barbarous treatment he had endured at the hands of the Patriots. Malcolm's story is one of extremes. Unlike other loyalists, who sought to balance their allegiance to the crown with the needs of their communities, Malcolm's unwavering arrogance made him a symbol of everything the Patriots despised about British rule. Patriot propaganda capitalized on his downfall, portraying him as the archetype of tyranny and overreach. Famous cartoons depicted his tarring and feathering, turning his humiliation into a rallying cry for the revolutionary cause. John Malcolm wasn't a tragic hero or a man caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. He was a loyalist whose actions and attitude made him infamous. His story reminds us that loyalty, when paired with cruelty and hubris, can lead not to honour, but to lasting infamy. As we move forward, we'll see that not all loyalists were defined by their arrogance, but by their resilience. Stay with us as we uncover the story of Thomas Brown, a man who turned victimhood into vengeance. As we leave behind the cautionary tale of John Malcolm, we now meet a loyalist whose story takes a darker and more determined turn. Thomas Brown wasn't a man to cower in the face of violence. Beaten and burned by the Sons of Liberty, Brown chose not to retreat, but to retaliate. His journey from victim to vengeful leader of the King's Rangers reveals how loyalty to the crown could manifest as fierce resistance in the wilderness of the American South. Thomas Brown's troubles began in 1774 when he arrived in Georgia, a British merchant seeking to build a new life in the colonies. But timing was not on his side. The revolution was gaining momentum, and Brown quickly found himself in the crosshairs of the Sons of Liberty, who demanded his allegiance to their cause. When he refused, the Patriots resorted to brutal intimidation. The attack was merciless. Brown was dragged from his home, beaten severely, and subjected to a horrifying punishment. His feet were scorched with hot tar, leaving him permanently injured. The message from the Sons of Liberty was clear. There would be no tolerance for loyalists in the new order. But instead of breaking Brown's spirit, the attack only hardened his resolve. Stripped of his home and livelihood, he fled to British-controlled Florida, determined to fight back. In Florida, Brown found a way to turn his personal vendetta into a broader loyalist cause. Convincing the colonial governor of his commitment to the crown, Brown was placed in command of a loyalist militia known as the King's Rangers. This ragtag group, bolstered by alliances with Native American tribes, became a formidable force in the South. Brown led the King's Rangers on a series of raids and skirmishes along the Georgia-Florida border, using guerrilla tactics to harass Patriot forces and disrupt their supply lines. His knowledge of the local terrain and his willingness to fight unconventionally made him a thorn in the side of the revolutionary forces. Brown's forces fought in key battles, including the defense of Savannah and engagements in Charleston and Augusta. Despite his injuries, he commanded with a relentless drive, earning a reputation as both a fierce warrior and a dangerous enemy. But even Brown's determination couldn't hold back the tide of the Revolution. In 1781, after a grueling siege, his forces were overwhelmed in Augusta, and he was forced to surrender. Released as part of a prisoner exchange, Brown refused to give up the fight entirely. When the British ultimately lost the war, he led many of his loyalist followers to the Bahamas, where he sought to rebuild a life from the ashes of defeat. In the Bahamas, Brown became a prominent figure. Elected to the local legislature, he established a successful sugar plantation and played a vital role in the community of loyalist refugees. For Brown, loyalty didn't end with the war. It became the foundation for his resilience and survival in the face of immense loss. Thomas Brown's story is a powerful example of how loyalty could drive a person to fight back, even when the odds were stacked against them. His transformation from a victim of patriot violence to a leader of loyalist resistance highlights the complexity of the revolution, where loyalty was not just an ideal, but a battleground in itself. As we move forward, we'll explore another loyalist whose allegiance to the crown was deeply rooted in cultural and familial ties. Join us as we uncover the story of Joseph Brant, a Mohawk leader who fought not just for the British, but for the survival of his people. As we transition from Thomas Brown's fierce and personal fight for loyalist survival, we turn to a figure who not only fought for the British crown, but also sought to preserve his people's way of life. Known as Thayendanegea to his Mohawk people, Joseph Brant was far more than a warrior. He was a diplomat, a leader, and a man who bridged two worlds in a time of immense turmoil. His story is one of loyalty, not just to the British, but to the survival and sovereignty of his people. Joseph Brant was born into the Mohawk Nation, one of the 6 nations of the Iroquois Confederacy. From an early age, he displayed an extraordinary aptitude for leadership. Fluent in 6 languages, including English and several indigenous dialects, Brant stood out as a man who could navigate both native and European worlds with ease. His education at a Christian mission school further sharpened his skills, preparing him for the complex role he would later play in the American Revolution. Brant's loyalty to the British wasn't blind, it was strategic. By the 1770s, the Iroquois Confederacy faced mounting pressure from colonial expansion, and Brant believed the British were more likely than the American revolutionaries to honour treaties and protect indigenous lands. With this conviction, Brant travelled to England in 1775, where he met King George III and secured promises of support for his people. The British, recognising Brant's influence, welcomed him as a vital ally. Returning to the colonies, Brant threw himself into the war effort. As a military leader, he rallied 4 of the 6 nations to fight alongside the British, arguing that their survival depended on a crown victory. Brant led his forces in numerous battles, including the campaign to retake New York and skirmishes in the Mohawk Valley. His knowledge of the land and his ability to mobilize native warriors made him a formidable opponent to the Patriots. But Brant's involvement in the war came at a cost. The Patriot press portrayed him as Monster Brant, accusing him of leading brutal raids on settlements. One such raid in the Mohawk Valley resulted in the deaths of 30 civilians, an act that was retaliation for an earlier Patriot attack. While Brant's actions were no more severe than those of Menodi, other military leaders during the war, that the image of a savage warrior was used to stoke fear and rally Patriot support. When the war ended with a British defeat, Brant and his people faced an uncertain future. The Treaty of Paris, which ended the conflict, made no provisions for native allies, leaving the Iroquois Confederacy vulnerable to American expansion. Brant, ever the diplomat, worked tirelessly to secure land rights for his people. He negotiated with British and American leaders, eventually leading a group of Mohawks to settle on a reserve in Ontario, Canada. Brant's later years were spent advocating for his people's sovereignty and fighting against the betrayal of promises made during the war. Despite his efforts, the encroachment of settlers on indigenous lands continued, forcing Brant to navigate a world that often disregarded the contributions and sacrifices of its native allies. Joseph Brant's story is one of remarkable complexity. He was a man who walked the fine line between two cultures, using his skills as a negotiator and warrior to fight for both his people and his chosen allies. His loyalty to the British was rooted in pragmatism, but his ultimate allegiance was to the Mohawk nation. In a world that betrayed its promises, Brant's resilience and dedication made him a towering figure in the history of the American Revolution. As we move forward, we'll explore another dimension of loyalist experience, this time through the story of Boston King, a man who saw loyalty to the crown not as a choice, but as a path to freedom. Stay with us for his powerful story. As we transition from Joseph Brant's fight to protect his people, we turn to a story that highlights a different kind of loyalty, one born not out of politics, but necessity. For enslaved Africans like Boston King, loyalty to the British crown wasn't about ideology. It was about survival, freedom, and the hope of a life unshackled from oppression. Boston King's journey is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable adversity. Boston King was born into slavery in South Carolina, a colony where the institution of slavery was deeply entrenched. For Boston, like thousands of other enslaved people, the American Revolution presented an opportunity, a chance to escape bondage. The British, recognizing the potential to undermine the Patriot cause, offered freedom to any enslaved person who fled to their lines and fought for the crown. It was a promise that Boston King couldn't ignore. His first attempt at freedom was fraught with danger. In 1780, after enduring years of brutal treatment, Boston escaped from his enslaver and fled to British-controlled Charleston. But freedom was precarious. The journey to British lines was perilous, and even among supposed allies, escaped enslaved people were vulnerable to recapture. Boston himself was briefly imprisoned by a British officer who planned to sell him back into slavery. Only by sheer luck did he escape again and find refuge in the British Army. Once with the British, Boston King joined the Black Loyalists, thousands of formerly enslaved Africans who fought for the crown in exchange for their freedom. Life in the army was far from easy. Boston faced illness, hunger, and the constant threat of death. At one point, he contracted smallpox, a deadly disease that ravaged both armies during the war. Despite these challenges, he survived, driven by the promise of freedom. When the war ended in 1783, Boston King and thousands of other Black Loyalists anxiously awaited the British government's fulfillment of its promise. For many, this was a moment of heartbreak. The Treaty of Paris, which concluded the war, made no guarantees for formerly enslaved people, and some were forcibly returned to their former owners. But for Boston and his wife Violet, salvation came in the form of the British evacuation of New York. The couple was among the 3,000 Black Loyalists granted certificates of freedom and transported to Nova Scotia, Canada. Life in Nova Scotia was far from the freedom Boston had envisioned. The Black Loyalists faced poverty, discrimination, and broken promises of land and resources. Yet Boston King's resilience shone through. He became a preacher, drawing strength from his faith, and wrote a memoir detailing his journey from slavery to freedom. His words provide a rare and invaluable insight into the experiences of Black Loyalists during the Revolutionary War. Later in life, Boston joined a group of black settlers who migrated to Sierra Leone in West Africa. There, he continued his work as a preacher and educator, helping to establish a new community for freed Africans. His legacy endures as a powerful reminder of the struggles and triumphs of those who sought freedom in the midst of war. Boston King's story sheds light on a lesser-known chapter of the American Revolution. For the Black Loyalists, loyalty to the British Crown wasn't about taking sides in a political conflict. It was about claiming their humanity and fighting for the right to live as free individuals. As we move to our final story, we'll explore the life of Jonathan Boucher, a loyalist preacher whose fiery sermons and defiant spirit made him a controversial figure in revolutionary America. Stay tuned. For these 7 individuals, loyalty to the British Crown came at an immense personal cost. They endured the loss of family, freedom, and homeland, their lives forever shaped by the choices they made during one of history's most tumultuous times. From the prisons of Connecticut to the battlegrounds of the South, from the icy shores of Nova Scotia to the halls of exile in England, their stories remind us that loyalty, though noble, is often fraught with sacrifice. So, what would you sacrifice for your beliefs? And how will history remember you for it? These questions, as relevant today as they were in 1775, challenge us to reflect on the complexities of loyalty, identity, and conviction. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the untold stories of the American Revolution. If you enjoyed this dive into history, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. There's so much more history waiting to be uncovered. Stay tuned for the next chapter.